Hey guys, my name is Tristan, and this is my second video. For those of you who don't read Hebrew, this says Connecticut. Sorry, it's backwards because of the camera. Ko, ne, t, e, k, t. Connecticut. Yay! Anyways, so on to the second half of my story. I had started talking a little bit about the relationship that I had with my father, with my mother, the relationship that they had with their parents and myself as well. Um, when I was 9 years old, um, my father decided that he was going to try to convince my mom to allow me to fly to South Dakota where he lived, and he still does now with his third wife. Um, and he wanted me to be there for 30 days. And before this trip, my relationship with my grandmother was not, it wasn't that bad. I remember when we got off of the plane, they were waiting for us there, and I remember getting out, and they had toys. They had Cabbage Patch dolls in their hands, and I got one, and my sisters got one, and I remember that when Katie got hers, she was just sick for whatever reason, and she threw up on the top, all over the top of her Cabbage Patch doll, and I remember for the years after that, when she had it, it stained the top of the head underneath the yarn hair, and I don't know. I always think of that. But before this trip, my relationship with my grandmother was not at all strained, and I was, I think I was just too young to be threatening at that time, and I had no relationship with my father to be a reminder of what had led to our being in her home. Um, my mom traveled with about $300 in her pocket, and us three kids. My father stayed in New Mexico at the time, and he promised that we would get all of our things, but he ended up selling them all. And one of the things that he sold was a baby grand piano that my grandmother had shipped to my mother when we were in Alaska, and it was brought down with us to New Mexico. And Dad went ahead and he sold that. Um, I remember that being certainly a source of contention for my grandmother as far as my father was concerned. But I didn't really pay attention to my grandmother too much. I didn't really remember paying attention to my grandfather that much. I think that it's really difficult to remember what my relationship was with them because at that time they really weren't the focus of my life. I think I was still trying to struggle through figuring out exactly what had just happened with my parents and why we were here all of a sudden. Um, but when when I made that trip, my mother asked me if I wanted anything, and I said the only thing I wanted was enough money to buy a Shirley Temple while I was on the plane. They were my favorite drinks, and I remember I used to get them all the time at whatever restaurants we used to go to. And that really was, it's really a good example of who my mother is. I remember many, many times my mother being just the type to hold everyone and anyone, any of us, and she loved to be hugged, she loved to be kissed, she loved to be loved, and it was and is so easy to say I love you to my mother just because you know that she really does love you back, and she really is that type of a person, and I feel like we have that kind of a connection. We have that much in common. I think that a lot of her desperation and her need to be loved is something that's really mirrored in myself. Um, and it's because we both shared the same relationship with her mother. Um, I I remember when I got to South Dakota, I got off the plane, and I remember being asked if I had brought any money with me, and my stepmother at the time was an awful woman named Nova Lee, which is the perfect stepmother name. And I told her yes, and she took the money, and she told me it was to help pay her back for the improvements that had been made in their home, which I found out when I got to their home was actually just a trailer park in Rapid City. Um, uh, very, very Very traumatic experience. Leaving the airport, I think, was one of the most traumatic experiences that I still remember very vividly. And I remember being given the tour in the cockpit and looking out and seeing Mom in the big windows at the airport looking at me, and the pilot had me wave, and Mom waved back, and in that instant, I felt. I felt this overwhelming urge to cry, to scream, to want to be back with Mom. I felt this just drop in the pit of my stomach, and I knew that I had to be back with her, and I couldn't because the plane was backing up. We were leaving, and they pulled me kicking and screaming to my seat, and there was a gentleman on the plane, a lawyer, I think he was, and he offered to help calm me down, and we sat there and he talked, and we talked the entire flight, and before I knew it, I was there, and then I got off and I met Novalee. Um, Novalee asked me if I wanted to see my father, and I said yes, and she brought me to visit him. He worked at the time as a janitor in the elementary school there in Rapid City, and I saw him for about an hour. Um, I I did not see him again after that until the very last day that I was there. For the next 29 days, I I was pretty much kept away from him. Um, I would spend the first 2 weeks I spent in Novalee's parents' house in the basement room of her brother. And when I would argue with them about staying down there and not being able to go out, they decided that I was ungrateful to what they had offered me, and they refused to look after me anymore. Um, so Novalee had to keep me at home, but she refused to let me stay in the trailer, so I spent the rest of the weeks when they were at work wandering around the trailer park by myself at 9 years old. I remember making one friend when I was there, and I had one experience where I fell and I cut my leg open, and I remember that being the highlight of the trip because of how much I hated Novalee. Oh, we had met Novalee once before when we were very young, and I remember Katie, when she met her, she just looked up at her, and the only thing that came out of her mouth was, I just want you to know that you're not my mother, that my father was with my mother first, and you mean nothing to me. And I just remember her being, God, she had to have been like 4 or 5 years old, but she just looked her dead in the eyes and just was out with it. That was it. And Novalee was not able to respond. She was completely shocked. And I remember Mom was standing behind us. We were just being dropped off. And wow, that was an experience. But anyways, it was hilarious when I broke my leg because I didn't know that I had, well, not break, but when I cut it open, and I remember it was hilarious because when I got to the house, I had no idea that I had done it. I didn't know I was bleeding. I didn't know I'd cut myself open. I'd fallen on a little wrought iron stoop, and I had put a nasty gash to the bone in my lower leg, the left leg. And when I got there and opened the door, Novalee screamed. She completely freaked out, wrapped me up in a big blanket, dragged me off to the emergency room. They sewed me up, told me I was a good boy, um, gave me this little plastic syringe, for water or whatever, and which was eventually taken away from me because I used to squirt it at their dog. They had a golden lab or a retriever or something. But I just remember that was wonderful because she was so terrified. Um, I basically just kind of wandered around the trailer park, and the day before I was scheduled to leave, I asked if my dad would buy me the soundtrack to Disney's Aladdin. But Novalee convinced him that my mother had only sent me there to use him for money. And for the next 24 hours, he fought with my mom, threatening to keep me and to not send me back. And I remember being terrified that I was never going to see my mother again, and all the emotions flooded back from being in the airport and being in the cockpit, and one of the worst, most frightening experiences of my life. Um, Eventually, I did get sent back, and I did get the Aladdin soundtrack, but I only saw him one more time after that when I was 13, and that was the very last time I saw him. Um, After I'd returned from South Dakota, people noticed a real big difference in me, my personality, and my behavior, and it was very true. I was very closed off, and the reason for this was because I was starting to realize that I had a father physically, genetically, I was connected to this man, but in all other ways, my father didn't love me, and I really didn't have a father, and I knew that I was not going to, and it was a huge burden on me, because then I also realized that I really had to take care of my mother, and my mother and I grew very close after that. I remember after I came back, there were nights when um, a lot of nights my mother would come back from work, and she would just throw herself on me, and she would cry, and she would tell me what a horrible mother she was, and how sorry she was, and how she was trying so hard, and she'd ask me if she was a bad mom, and I would tell her, no, 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 you're not a bad mom, you're my mom, I love you more than anything, and this continued for a while. At that point, we actually shared a room. My grandparents' home is a 4-bedroom raised ranch. Um, they technically 3 at that point. My uncle lived in the basement room, and when my sister, she was pregnant with my second youngest sister, she built, or my grandfather built an addition onto the house, off of the porch end of the house, so that she would have her own room. Um, but there were times days when she wouldn't really come home, and there would just be months and months where she'd work sometimes 70 hours a week, and it it really it really put a hole in me. And I remember I used to some nights put my head under the faucet, and I'd run the water into my ear just to give myself an ear infection, and it would force Mom to come home to be with me. I did a lot of things to try to get attention at home, especially from my grandfather, just because he is such a stoic person, um, so emotionally detached. I would fall asleep on my desk, and I would leave my door propped open a little bit with a light on, so that when he would go to bed, he would see it on, and he would pick me up and put me in bed. And he used to kiss me on the forehead when I was younger, and I know that he thought I didn't know that, but I know that. And it was wonderful to me. Um, the relationship between my grandmother and I completely fell apart after that trip, and it developed into an extremely abusive and volatile one. It was both verbal and physical, and at times even mental abuse. The mental were the most damaging. I was told I was a waste of breath, that I would have never amount to anything, that I was just like my father, that I was a worthless piece of shit, that I would be just like him and his brother and his father, and I would die miserable and alone, and I'd be a janitor. I would just have nothing to offer anyone. Um, and it's caused a lot of problems for me, in the way that I really saw myself, and it 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 made things very difficult for me, especially in regards to dealing with food. Um, in school, I developed bulimia as a result of her strict food policing. I wasn't allowed to cook, and I was told I ate too much for my age and for her budget. Yet my sisters were completely spoiled. They got whatever cereals and snacks and things that they wanted, Gushers and Fruit by the Foot and fancy cereals and all kinds of things. But for me, everything was kept locked up. All the cereals and cookies and crackers were kept locked up in a pantry with all the pastas and easily cooked foods, and all of the frozen things like ice creams and popsicles and frozen waffles and things, and frozen pizzas were all hidden and locked away in a freezer, in the garage with a big padlock wrapped around it. And my grandmother stopped sleeping with my grandfather in the same bedroom. She actually started sleeping out on the couch to make sure that I couldn't come out of my room and cook or drink. Um, and so that caused a lot of problems. I especially was not allowed to drink at night because of the medication I was on. I was put on Ritalin after the 2nd grade, and to put me down to sleep and make sure that I could go to sleep, I was put on an anti-anxiety medication called Elavil. But the side effect was that if I took the pills, my body would completely dry itself out, and any little bit of water would cause me to wet the bed. And so it got to a point to where I wasn't allowed to drink at night, especially because of the medication, and in combination with her belief that I was a thief and a liar who would rob them blind and eat them out of house and home. She slept on the couch in the living room, which faced the end of the hall. The living room was here, the hall here, their bedroom was here, sister's bedroom was here, and my bedroom was here, and the bathroom was here in the middle, next to the kitchen. So I would sneak out and I would go into the bathroom, and some nights I would be so thirsty I would just shut the door and I would kneel in front of the toilet and I'd put my hands in the bowl and lift up water and make the trickling sound as though I was urinating, and I would drink the water out of the toilet bowl. And I did this for years. Um, I continued probably until I was about 18 years old. Um, and things only really got worse as far as she was concerned. As far as the abuse was concerned, it was something that the entire neighborhood was, you know, they knew about. She yelled. Yelling was her forte. She would follow me in a conversation and just yell behind my back and nag at me. I would shut the door and she would stand on the other side of the door and she would just yell through the door. If she was on the phone with somebody, she would start a conversation by telling them everything that I'd done wrong while I was standing right there, and I was just portrayed as this constant shame and embarrassment to her, whether I had done anything or not. And anything that my sisters did wrong, where I was mysteriously somehow always held accountable for. I was always responsible for whatever my sisters did, um, and that was just the way that things were. Um, I remember even to this day the walls are lined with patched holes from the kicking and the punching and the screaming, and for the last 2 years that I lived there, I didn't have a door. I remember one day she followed me and she just stood on the other side of my door and she yelled and screamed and she banged on it, and I just had enough, so I stood up and I kicked the door out of the frame while she was on the other side, and after that I wasn't allowed to have a door and I had to hang a sheet up to have any privacy. If I had friends come over, she would tell them how stupid I was and she would embarrass me, go to any lengths just to embarrass me, and my mother said that she used to do the same exact thing to her. And that's what really made it difficult, because as much as I had my mother as an ally, everything that came out of her mouth was, "Oh well, it's what I dealt with. It's what I dealt with." And I know that she didn't mean that as a way of deflecting the problem. It was just to let me understand that there was nothing that we could do, that we were in this situation because of my father, and as much as she was trying to get us out of it, it was just a very volatile yet unavoidable situation. And honestly, as much as I feel like sometimes my mother could have done better or been stronger, I realize now that she did the best that she could just to allow us the opportunity to survive. So that's part two. I also have part three coming up, and I will share that with you at another time. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.